Hey there, Twins fans, and welcome to another episode of Twins in the 2000s, Twins Daily's journey through the contemporary history of the Minnesota Twins. We're covering every season since the turn of the century. I am Nick Nelson, joined by John Bonus of TwinsDaily.com, and today we're going to talk about the 2004 season. A season that I think kind of represents a little bit of a last hurrah for a big part of the nucleus that ushered the Twins back into respectability in 2001 and 2002. So guys like Doug Mientkiewicz, Luis Rivas, Christian Guzman, Corey Koski, Jock Jones. This is going to be really the last push that the Twins are able to make with a lot of these players that the fans have come to love. AJ Pierzynski had been traded the previous offseason. As you look back at this season, John, does it hit you as a little bit of the end of an era?
Yeah, I mean, I always think of those three as being sort of one generation. Those 2001 through 2004 being sort of one generation, and then afterwards being sort of a second generation, with maybe 2006 being a little bit of an overlap, a little bit of the best of both sides of it. I think one of the things that I had kind of forgotten until we started doing these is how much turnover there really was between 2001 and 2004 by the end of this season. How many of the core players ended up being gone by this point? Even entering this season, you traded away Pierzynski. Mientkiewicz was on his way out. Eric Milton had been traded in the season for Silva and in the offseason for Silva. We'd lost Guardado. We'd lost Hawkins. Joe Nathan was he was coming around. There was already, I mean, you already take a look at sort of the names that were available that were in that lineup. You still had, Guzman and Koski and Hunter and Jock Jones, right? But, a lot of that's half of the sort of core lineup that was around in 2001, 2002. And the other half had already started leaving.
Yeah, the new identity of the team, I think, really starts taking shape behind some guys like Johan Santana, who now, we talked in the last couple episodes about him yo-yoing back and forth between the rotation and bullpen. He is now definitively a starter, definitively their ace, and he's really going to show it this season. Joe Nathan, who you mentioned, came over in the AJ Pierzynski trade. The Twins lose two key relievers from the back end of their bullpen during the previous offseason with LaTroy Hawkins and Eddie Guardado. Guardado coming off two straight All-Star appearances.
And somehow get better.
Joe Nathan, unbelievably, is better than anyone before him when he steps into that role. And then Joe Mauer, ton of buzz around Joe Mauer heading into this season. The Twins have traded Pierzynski to pave the path for him, and they fully commit to Mauer as their opening day catcher. The excitement, I think, back then around Mauer, this number one prospect, this homegrown number one overall pick, was just extremely high heading into this season, as I recall.
Yeah, I mean, he had been the number one prospect in baseball a couple years in a row. Clearly, there was a lot. I mean, and people had been following his career ever since he was the number one overall pick on the draft. And in fact, there was even before that, but he was, playing baseball here in high school in St. Paul. And, there was all the debate about whether or not he should be the first overall draft pick, et cetera, for the Twins, whether or not they should go get Mark Pryor, et cetera. So there was a lot of excitement about Mauer, not just there's always gonna be a lot of excitement around a number one overall pick. There's always gonna be a lot of excitement about the number one overall prospect. But then you had Mauer's background and the the fact that he was from St. Paul and people had been talking about him for years and everyone wanted to see him play. So yeah, that even for as little coverage as there were in the minor leagues in 2004, which it was minuscule compared to what it is now. There was a tremendous amount of anticipation for his debut.
Yep. I mean, he moved up fast. I mean, just to put it in some perspective, you look at Royce Lewis, who was the number one overall pick in 2017. Both these guys taken out of high school. This would be like if Royce Lewis was in the opening day lineup at shortstop in 2020. I mean, Here we are in 2022, and we're still talking about when Lewis is going to make his debut, maybe this year, maybe next year. Obviously, he's had some extraneous tribulations going on, but Mauer was just an incredibly polished, advanced hitter who just rocketed through the minors, and there was just no doubt he was ready by this point.
Yeah, I don't even know if he's ended up taking any at bats at AAA. Did he?
I think he skipped straight from AA.
Yeah.
So the start of Mauer's career was sort of a signal of things to come, both good and bad, I would say. In his debut on April 5th, in the home opener at the Metrodome, He has 2 hits, 2 walks, just showing the on-base machine that he's going to be. In his second game, he's chasing a foul ball, in that rubbery material. That's the warning track at the Metrodome. He kind of does a little dive move and hits his knee, tears the meniscus, has to undergo surgery, misses 2 months. Mauer's going to end up, he comes back playing for like 6 weeks, and then the pain and swelling force him to be shut down. So we see the greatness of Mauer already in this first season, and we see what's going to be a long future of injury woes and limitations physically, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was a bummer. I mean, especially because they traded away Pierzynski in the offseason, right? So suddenly Henry Blanco is the you take a look at which catcher got the most at bats. It was Henry Blanco in the 2004 season. And when that injury first happened, nobody was really sure how significant it was. Well, maybe a little torn meniscus, maybe it's So there was sort of a thought process. Well, he might be back really soon. Well, he kind of was back really soon, but then acted up again. Basically, missed most of that year.
Yep. So talking a little bit about the course of the season, the Twins, of course, are coming off back-to-back division titles. A season in 2003 that was good. They won 90 games. They won the division, got knocked out in the first round by the Yankees. Once again, here in 2004, they're looking at a pretty weak division, very winnable. Once again, didn't do a ton, not a lot of major moves during the offseason to improve, but a lot of turnover and a lot of transition with some new guys coming into the fold. So they get off to a little bit of a rough start. They go 12-16 in April. At this point, the White Sox are really managing to hang with them through a lot of the first half. And that really persists kind of through the All-Star break. The Twins had a couple of All-Stars on that team. They had, or I think just one on this one, Joe Nathan, who's going to emerge as we mentioned, just a star closer in his first season. But then after the All-Star break, they kind of start to separate themselves. They have a series in late July in Chicago where they sweep the White Sox. They go from a half game up in the division to 3.5 games up. And then they just took off. We talked a little bit before about how Gardenhire's teams had this penchant to really put the pedal to the metal when they were in contention. And certainly we saw that this year. They have a good August. They have a great September in which they go 17-11. And they end up winning the division by 9 games. As the White Sox sort of faded, they ended up winning like 83. So once again, not really any competition at the top of this AL Central, but the Twins went and earned it by having a good year. And the crucial factor in that is Johan Santana. He was extremely good in the first half, and he was unbelievable in the second half. In his last 15 starts, John, Johan Santana went 13-0 with a 1.21 ERA. The Twins won 14 of those 15 starts. Is that the most dominant stretch of pitching we've ever seen as Twins fans in our lifetimes? Because, I mean, I know, you could put in Liriano had a good run there too, but I just don't think there was anything quite to this length and this level of just absolute dominance.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair thing to say. I would like to take a look at what Liriano looked like, in the beginning of that 2006 season. But I will say this, because the amazing thing about Liriano in 2006 was that he was pitching better than the Cy Young Award winner, right?
Yeah.
But that as I recall, that did not last nearly as long as we had with Santana. I mean, he was unbelievable. He ended the season with a 2.6 ERA, something like that, and 228 innings as well. Like he wasn't just he was a workhorse who also he was an absolutely dominant. In fact, as I recall, I'd have to take a look at when this was, but I remember the Twins having one of the best ERAs overall for any starting rotation, sometime in 2004, 2005, 2006. But if you took a look at sort of the overall ERAs, it was mostly just Santana that ended up doing that. I mean, Radke had a good season that year. He bounced back from 2003, but Santana with a 2.61 ERA was just impacting everything in terms of the rotation. So
definitely. So the Twins win the AL Central with these. They once again go up against the Yankees in the ALDS. They once again win Game 1 behind Johan Santana, who combines with Juan Rincon and Joe Nathan to shut out the Yankees 2-0. Game 2 of this series, a big turning point in this season and really the history of Minnesota Twins postseason, because this starts a string of 18 straight playoff losses, and this was a painful game. It was a phenomenal game, a really, really good game. This was, even though the Twins won or lost this series 3-1, I look back at the series, this was incredible. They won the first game 2-0. Game two is an extra innings loss. They lose in 12 innings in this one. They lost the elimination game in 11 innings. This was just tightly played, excellent games. Here in game two, the Twins are down in Yankee Stadium by 2 entering the 8th. In comes Mariano Rivera. You're like, okay, well, here we go again. This is over. But they managed to scrape together a couple of runs. Morneau delivers an RBI still. Corey Koski follows with an RBI ground rule double. That would have been a go-ahead double if it didn't bounce over the fence. They go to extra innings. Torrey Hunter hits a go-ahead solo home run in the top of the 12th. And then Gardenhire decides to send Joe Nathan back out for a third inning of work. He'd already thrown 32 pitches. He'd thrown 52 pitches over the past 4 days. He's visibly gassed at this point, gives up a couple walks, RBI double to A-Rod. JC Romero comes in with the bases loaded and gives up a sac fly to win it against Hideki Matsui. This is a game that I look back in my mind. I was so annoyed by the way Gardenhire managed this game that I think it was one of the big triggers to make me start blogging.
That's funny. Spoiler alert, when we get to the moment of the season that matters, this is going to be my game 2. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it then. But that was a heartbreaking loss. They came back to the Twin Cities tied 1-1 as opposed to down or up 2-0 with Silva and I think Loge on the mound, or scheduled to be pitching games 3 and 4. Well, that's not a great recipe for winning. If you're up 2-0 there, you're guaranteed of a game 5 where you're going to see Santana back out on the hump. It was a tough series.
Yep. So
tough game. Yeah.
They come back to Minnesota. They drop to the last game of that series. The elimination game was another really painful one. They're up 5-1 going into the bottom of the 8th. Juan Rincon gives up 4 runs, including a 3-run homer by Ruben Sierra. Eventually, Gary Sheffield scores on a wild pitch from Kyle Loesch in the 11th. Rivera slams the door, and that's it for the 2004 Twins. Of course, those Yankees would go on to the ALDS, where they went up 3-0 against the Red Sox, and David Ortiz managed to will the Red Sox back to victory. They went 4 straight, go to the World Series. Doug Mientkiewicz, who was traded in the middle of the season, catches the last out of the World Series, and that's that. Fun 2004 season, but the outcome very much the same as 2003. Moving on with our discussion of the 2004 Minnesota Twins here on Twins in the 2000s. We'll talk a little bit about some of the top individual performances on that team. And we can't start with anyone other than Johan Santana. This was his breakthrough year. He pitches 228 innings, goes 20-6 with a 2.61 ERA, 6.8 wins above replacement, according to Fangraphs. We talked about it a little bit in the previous section, but just a tremendous year. Ends his season on a 13-0 run. He was unstoppable. I mean, he was the most automatic starting pitcher I've ever seen. He took the hill, and it was just a victory. And that was a huge part of the reason the Twins were able to pull away and easily win the division in the second half. He wins the AL Cy Young unanimously and finishes 6th in the MVP voting. This was certainly the announcement of Johan Santana's arrival as one of, if not the best starting pitcher in the major leagues, John.
20-game winner, right? This is something we hadn't seen for a while. Not to mention the 2.61 ERA, the 228 innings. And I mean, just excellence on every start basis. You pointed out they 13-0 over the last 15 games. It was an automatic win when you had Santana on the mound for the second half of that season. So, that is in fact, for a team that won a 90 games, something like that, that year, 92 games. I mean, Santana was responsible for, most of that difference.
Yep. And the guy behind him, you mentioned a little bit, a rebound year for Brad Radke. I think sort of an overlooked season. Brad Radke was excellent in 2004, overshadowed a little bit by the guy in front of him in the rotation. But Radke throws 219.2 innings, goes 11-8 with a 3.48 ERA. He's worth 5.0 wins above replacement. According to ERA Plus, this was the best season of Radke's career. This was really his last great season. And I think, just as much as having Santana atop the rotation, having that 1-2 punch when they really didn't have a lot of great pitching beyond those two. Carlos Silva sort of settling in as an average third starter. Kyle Loesch really has a drop off after his strong 2003 season, and they sort of struggle to find much of a consistent rhythm in that fifth rotation spot. But Radke was excellent this year, and it was just really fun to have him and Santana going 2 days in a row and giving you that strong starting pitching every turn through the rotation.
Yeah, before that, Radke had been hurt in 2002. 2002 he'd been hurt. 2003 he'd put up a 4.5 ERA, which is not terrible. Just so we're clear, like given the the offensive environment that was going on at that time, 4.5 ERA was still good enough that you got 212 innings out of it, right? You still kept him in there for a lot of games, but then to follow those. There was, he was also, 30 years old. He'd signed a big contract with the Twins. There was some question about how much longer he would be lasting. In 2004, 31 years old, he comes out, throws the 3.5 ERA, 219 innings. You're like, oh yeah, that's who we had. That's who this guy was. And you're right, it probably was. I don't. When I thought back to the 2004 season, I did not remember how good Brad Radke was because obviously everybody was paying attention to Santana. But Silva was workman-like. Loge was borderline kind of bad in 2004. But having those two at the top of the rotation really ended up carrying that rotation and kind of carrying the team.
It did indeed. And a new look bullpen was also crucial in this team's success. Joe Nathan was at the top of it, a converted shortstop who became a reliever in his last couple of years with the Giants. He was one of the headliners in the trade that the Twins made to send AJ Przinsky to the Giants during the previous offseason. This was just Terry Ryan knew what he was doing here. He saw Nathan as a potential closer, and Nathan turned out to be one of the best closers that there ever was, and he was as good as he would ever be in this first season. 72.1 innings, 44 saves, a 1.62 ERA, 3 wins above replacement out of the bullpen. You do not see that very often from a relief pitcher. It was incredible. I think Twins fans were almost a little spoiled by what they'd seen in the closer role the past couple of years with Everyday Eddie, and somehow Nathan managed to raise the bar. Just a tremendous performance coming through this bullpen.
When Nathan came over from the Giants, he wasn't a closer, right? He was just sort of a decent middle reliever that was going on. As I recall, there was some thought, even going to spring training, that he might end up with the closer role. And I'm trying to remember if they signed if it was this year or the year before, where they signed him to a contract in spring training that sort of indicated they thought he was going to be the closer for a long time, but they wanted to lock him up long term before he started making closer money in arbitration. Right, that was part of the brilliance of trading for him when they traded for him. But really, it wasn't just him either. That as much as we talk about, sort of the new generation that was starting to make its way up in the lineup, there was also a new generation throughout the bullpen. You had Nathan, you had Rincon, Romero was pretty much ending his run there. We'd already lost Hawkins. We'd already lost Guardado. You also had Grant Balfour. You had Jesse Crane, I think, was one of the, in fact, Balfour and Crane. Crane was, I think, the last guy in the bullpen, or one of the last guys in the bullpen that they could have used when Joe Nathan went back out there and gave out that lead. And Crane had looked pretty good in his time introductions there. So Grant Balfour was dealing in Game 4 of the ALDS when they ended up pulling him for Juan Rincon. Shame that Juan Rincon ended up giving up that lead in Game 4 because he had a 2.63 ERA in 2004. He was really good. He became every bit as good and valuable as Hawkins was. Just stepped right into that role and took it over.
Yep, the pitching staff very much led the way here for this 2014, which you can see because not really a lot of great offensive performances of note. We mentioned that Mauer's season was cut very short by the injuries. Justin Morneau starts to step in after Mientkiewicz is traded at midseason, but he only plays 75 games. Does hit 19 home runs, so he starts to look like he's going to be that guy. Really, the top performance on offense this year, and a very fun one, I thought, is Lou Ford, who kind of comes out of nowhere, fills that DH spot a lot of the time, which is now sort of open because the Twins are starting to sour on Matt LeCroy. He's a good outfielder, and he's just, we look back at him, I think, as sort of a fun, scrappy, gimmicky kind of player. I don't know. He was definitely sort of a one-hit wonder, but in this 2004 season, he was excellent. He hit 299, 383 on base percentage, played 154 games, super regular, super valuable, steals 20 bases. So Lou Ford, definitely a player worth noting in this MVP conversation.
Yeah, I mean he had the second highest OPS amongst the starters in the lineup, right? Right next to Corey Kosky, sandwiched between Corey Kosky and Torrey Hunter. He was and he had 658 plate appearances or at bats. Like he was the leadoff guy. He was a. I had never. I do not. Another thing I didn't remember. I didn't remember that Lou Ford was basically a full-time player for an entire season, but he was, and that was his kind of rookie year there, as I recall. So hell of a year.
Radke, worth note. Nathan, worth note. Ford, worth calling out. But I think without question, how can you go any other direction than saying that Johan Santana was the MVP of this team here in his first Cy Young season? You with me on that one, Johnny?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely, this was the year of Johan.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our conversation of the Twins 2004 season, we'll talk about some of the most memorable moments and developments that took place in this season. A lot of these we touched on a little bit, but we'll just sort of circle back and try to pick out which one we think is the most meaningful or significant. So opening day, of course, Joe Mauer singling twice and walking twice in his MLB debut. I recall that his first major league hit was a seeing eye ground ball single right up the middle there at the Metrodome, which was the exact same type of hit as his 2000th hit about 16, 17 years later. And that's just Joe Mauer to a T for you, isn't it?
Yeah, and then unfortunately the next day he ended up getting hurt. So that was also a little bit of Joe Mauer to a T. Twins, I think one of the things that people forget or don't recognize about the aughts, about those two generations, is how many of their top prospects ended up getting hurt, just as they were being introduced to the majors or soon afterwards. The very next year after Morneau is, really going to be the full-time first baseman, he ends up getting plunked in the head by a hit in the face or hit in the head by a Ron Vallone pitch. He ends up missing a chunk of time. We end up losing Liriano a little bit later. We lost Mauer's 2004 season. We lose Kilty on, just as he's ready to jump into the lineup. Like there's the Twins were really plagued by injuries to some of their top prospects, and that's one of the things that Mauer certainly bounced back, had a great career, potentially a Hall of Fame career, but yeah, it was a drag. The 2004 season was a drag for Joe Mauer and for people who were waiting to see what he could do.
Yeah, and when you look at how this team just needed a little more offense, if he could have stayed healthy, it probably would have made a big difference maybe for this team's fate, especially in some of those really close postseason games.
Sure.
10 days later, Joe Nathan notches his first save as a Minnesota Twin. He had one career save coming into this, working that setup role in the Giants bullpen, but this was the first of 260 eventual saves as a Minnesota Twin, far and away the leader in Twins history. He would be by the time he finished. And yeah, I mean, it just, like we mentioned before, super reliable, didn't always necessarily project it visibly on the mound. He had those mannerisms of the raspberrying his lips and breathing and huffing and puffing, but you know what, he always got it done from the very start here, including here in his first career save attempt as a Twin.
Yeah, it's especially for a converted shortstop, right? Somebody who wasn't even supposed to be pitching in the major leagues. He ended up switching roles in the San Francisco Giants organization. Looked like he was going to be a fairly dominant middle reliever the year before, and then clearly took steps forward with the Twins and locked that position down for years, and eventually got paid what he was worth with a big long-term deal.
In July, a series of games that I think sort of symbolizes how good this starting pitching was, especially, and how much this pitching staff really led the way for this team. They go a streak of 32 consecutive scoreless innings, a franchise record that included complete game shutouts, back-to-back shutouts by Santana, Radke, and Loesch. Wow. I haven't seen anything like that since, and that's quite an amazing accomplishment to be able to go through that long of a stretch without giving up a run.
Yeah, well, I mean, Santana, you had Santana and Radke. You wouldn't I guess 2006 would be the other time where maybe you might have seen that, right? Where you had Santana and Liriano, and to some extent Radke still, dealing in that year. But yeah, this was a golden age for Twins pitching that we probably did not appreciate how special it was at the time. Santana was just a legitimate stud, and also to have come out of basically nowhere, to suddenly exactly what you hear about every spring training is like, oh, so and so is working on a new pitch, you could totally change their game. Well, it's all 95% of the time it's BS, right? But with Santana learning that changeup, totally changed his career arc, and turned him into a Cy Young winner.
Yeah, I think maybe that's why Twins fans are a little more we've magnetized towards that story of a pitcher showing up at spring training with a new pitch, because we've seen it happen in the most incredible way in Major League history. Maybe
we've certainly. I also think we've certainly paid more attention to Rule 5 draft picks than most people would pay attention to, and partly that is because of Johan Santana.
At the deadline in 2004, the Twins trade Doug Mientkiewicz to the Boston Red Sox in a 4-team blockbuster. We talked a little bit earlier about how this 2004 season was the beginning of a transition. We'd seen Przinsky traded the previous winter to make room for Mauer, and now here they sort of follow up with a move to make room for Morneau as a full-time first baseman. This was quite the big swap at the time. Lots of different players involved. Nomar Garcia-Parra went from the Red Sox to the Cubs. I think another interesting thing to note is that in this trade, 2 other future Twins changed hands, none of them involving the Twins, but Orlando Cabrera and Brendan Harris also involved in this deal. The Twins got a reliever named Justin Jones in the deal who never really amounted to much, but I think the significance of this move is really, just continuing that evolution and turnover to this sort of next generation that's going to start to take over this core.
Yeah, it was an odd trade to make. It was an odd trade to make because it did not help the team at the trade deadline. As I recall, the Twins were playing the Red Sox at the Metrodome when they made that trade. So Mientkiewicz just walked from one dugout to the other.
That's right.
At the time, and it was one of those. It was a big blockbuster trade. The Twins had just a little part of it. It certainly helped Mientkiewicz. Like Mientkiewicz got to win a World Series as part of that trade, which turned out pretty well for him. But it also was signaling sort of the end of his career, and it ended up being pretty close to the end of his career.
Yeah, he was not really having a great season. A guy who sort of had forged a reputation on hitting for average. He was hitting only 246 with a 363 slugging when the Twins parted. So it was time. But yeah, it worked out well for Mientkiewicz, who ended up getting the winning World Series ball, which became a controversy of its own. But yeah, joins David Ortiz on that super exciting, historic Boston Red Sox championship team. September 20th, 2004, at White Sox, the Twins clinch their 3rd straight AL Central title with an 8-2 victory over the White Sox. 4 days later in Cleveland, Johan Santana sets the Twins' single-season strikeout record, which is noteworthy mainly because, he threw 228 innings. In the early days of the franchise, guys were throwing 250 plus routinely. But yeah, he would end up throwing 265 strikeouts. This was a franchise that really we hadn't seen many strikeout pitchers come through by nature of the way that these stats were sort of built and the philosophies of Ron Gardenhire and Rick Anderson. But Santana, with that changeup, it was a wiffle ball. People just could not touch it. And he was just racking up the Ks all year long, and it was extremely exciting.
Yeah, he was worth the price of admission. Every time he took the mound, you never knew it was going to happen. So it was fun to watch.
As we mentioned, October 5th, 2004, the Twins managed to get that Game 1 victory against the Yankees at Yankee Stadium. Santana, Rincon, and Nathan combining to shut out New York. Again, sort of their formula for success this year, just great pitching and enough offense to win. It was the same formula they executed to get a Game 1 win at Yankee Stadium in 2003. And then, I didn't list it here, but I do think the crux point, as you mentioned, was the game the following day at Yankee Stadium, a game they very much could have won, would have taken a 2-0 lead coming back to the Metrodome. but just a wild game that goes 12 innings, and they're just not able to pull it off.
Yeah, it was, to me, that is the moment of the year, and maybe the moment of the decade. That maybe along with the 2006 Torrey Hunter misplay in Game 1 of the 2006 series, but that was that loss stuck with the Twins. It put them in a much worse position going into the rest of that series. Like I said, that set it up so that Game 3 they were facing Carlos Silva. Well, Carlos Silva was just killed by the Yankees. It felt like that game, the third game, was when Silva just kind of gave up ground ball after ground ball after ground ball, but somehow they just kept finding holes. And then the Game 4 where Grant Balfour is dealing, Gardner and I played it by the numbers. We went with Racone in the 8th inning. In retrospect, he probably should have stuck with Balfour for another inning. So.
Yep. So a few days after that, October 9th, the Twins fall 6-5 in 11 innings in Game 4 and are eliminated by the Yankees for a second straight year. Unfortunately, will not be the end of their torments against the Yankees in October, but a great season and a really great series. If you can set aside, I don't think Twins fans had quite the complex about the postseason yet by this point, and it was tough, but it was a lot of fun. I mean, I look back at this as the postseason that really elevated my interest in the Twins, from sort of casual to hardcore. The next year I started blogging, and sort of the rest is history. It was a very exciting series and just really fun to dissect tactically. I think there were so many decisions by Gardenhire and by Joe Torre, that were really interesting. The usage of these pitchers, the Mariano Rivera, the bullpen games that were being played late in these extra inning games. It was a great series, and the Yankees and Twins have never been the same since. It's been so one-sided. It hasn't been this as much of a back and forth kind of even keeled affair.
I've got to correct myself, Nick. Game 4 of that series was started by Johan Santana. He went 5 innings and only gave up 1 earned run, but he only went 5 innings because he was pitching on short rest. I think.
Right. There was elimination, so they just
Kyle Loesch did end up being the losing pitcher, but he was the losing pitcher in the extra innings when he got brought in when the game was tied to extend it. So. The Twins threw everything they had at the Yankees that year, and they had enough guns that year with Santana and Radke, dealing Radke at the top of the rotation to do it, but they didn't have much room for error, and things just did not fall their way in games 2 and 4.
The final memorable moment of 2004, the 11th of November, Johan Santana wins the AL Cy Young by unanimous vote. Recognizing a season. I mean, there was really no doubt. We talked about how great he was. He was the team MVP. He really carried this team in the second half with his automatic victories basically every fifth day. It was awesome to see this recognition, and really, for me, this is the number one most memorable moment of the season. I just think it encapsulates everything that Santana was able to do and everything that he was going to be for this team for the next several years.
Yeah, I mean, it was a unanimous vote for a reason. We all knew it was going to be happening. We watched the second half of the season knowing that he had been setting himself up for that, and it was just a matter of how much more he would carry the team into the postseason. So.
Yeah, the Cy Young voters got this one right. That wasn't always going to be the case, as we'll discuss in the future. We'll be returning next time for an episode on the 2005 season, where the Twins will attempt to win a 4th straight division title, but they're going to run into a little bit more competition this time around. So thank you all for joining us for this 2004 season. Make sure you subscribe to Twins Daily on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, and check out the website for new episodes and content all the time. We'll see you for 2005. Thank you.
Bye-bye.